All right, I will start by introducing our speaker today and first introduce myself, Matt Helmers with Iowa State University, ISU Extension and Outreach, and participate with the Iowa Learning Farms. For those that don't know, Iowa Learning Farms is a uh, collaborative project among the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, Iowa DNR, Iowa NRCS, and ISU Extension and Outreach. We've been around for over 20 years and excited to be hosting the conservation webinar series as one of the activities associated with Iowa Learning Farm. So, as always, as we go through the webinar today, if you have questions, please type those in the chat box and we'll get those to uh, Dr. Fike at the end of his talk. And so we're really fortunate today to have with us Dr. John Fike, that's a professor and forage extension specialist at Virginia Tech. For those that don't know, that's in Blacksburg, Virginia. And he's going to talk to us about trees and pastures. And so title is Nobody Wants Trees in Pastures, Do They? Question mark. And I have to say, this your title has facilitated some interest in the webinar today. Just I think getting that title out there got people interested. So with that, John, I will turn it over to you. And again, if folks have questions, please type those in the chat box and we'll get those to John at the end of the talk. So with that, the virtual floor is all yours.
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate the introduction. Apologies for my squirming around in my seat and dealing with extraneous noises, phone calls, and that sort of thing. Thank you for being here, everybody. I'm going to tell you, I'm going to try to put this in my very personal context, and so bear with me on that. Hopefully, I have something of an interesting story to tell, and I look forward to some further conversation with you afterwards. This presentation is one that I've given in a couple of spots, and I submitted this to the agronomy and crop science meetings a few years ago, and I did it with some specific intention to consider the potential of these integrated temperate zone silvopasture systems. And I wanted to take it to that meeting because I wanted to get a bit of history of how I got into silvopastures. I wanted to provide some learning curve on the topic, and I wanted to spur some others to think about the potential to work on it. And so, that's was true for the agronomy meetings, and it's maybe potentially true for producers in Iowa. To get that ball rolling, I need to define the practice, and I'm gonna do that in part by stating what silvopasture is not. I'm going to touch on some results that we've had in silvopasture studies that we've conducted in Virginia. And so you may say, well, that may not fit the Iowa context, and fine, we can go there, have that conversation. And once I get that done, I'll kind of revisit that question about, do people want trees in pastures or not, with some findings from surveys that we've conducted in Virginia. And then I'm going to think a little bit more about these systems in the future, and just I have a couple of slides to maybe kind of consider them in an Iowa context. So before I do anything more, I need to place myself for you. If you can, actually, I'll try it over here. I lost my mouse. I left my mouse at home. Blacksburg is here. We're in the Appalachians. We would probably say Southern Appalachians, the northern part of the Southern Appalachians. From the USDA hardiness zone map, you can see we're sort of in the middle of the transition zone. And that is also the primary geography of the fescue belt, which I have outlined in the orange elliptical rectangle, as it were. And that's important. The fescue belt is important, so I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. But anyway, pretty moderate environment where we live in Virginia. So I don't know if any of you have any sort of university faculty affiliation, but this is kind of the context I'm coming out of. I want you to just kind of imagine yourself as a new faculty member, your early career folks, and you're not tenured as an assistant professor in forage research. And this scientist colleague from forestry comes calling. Now, in my case, this is a guy named Jim Berger. And Jim was pretty smooth, and he has this kind of way of drawing you in when he talks. And he says he's kind of monotonic, but it's kind of compelling. He says, John, I've got this agroforestry practice called silvopasture, where trees are integrated with forages and livestock production with multiple benefits, and I need someone to work on the forage component. Would you be interested in doing that research? So again, you're an untenured professor. You need stuff to do. You're looking for opportunities to get pubs and whatnot. So my first reaction was what? It was sure, yeah, I'll be happy to work on that with you, Jim. But in the back of my head, I was thinking, nobody wants trees and pastures. So I've already answered my questions, right? Well, don't be too hard on me here as an apostle for silvopastures, as it were. Um, you may think, well, this guy's hypocritical or really inconsistent, but give me my due relative to my context. I grew up on a small dairy farm, and I was completely naive to this idea of integrated systems. And I was probably also biased by my own mistaken views. So Jim was not talking about cows running loose in the woods like you might see in the left. And he was not talking about a single tree out in the pasture where all the animals are congregating, creating a wallow and a vector for disease and pests and that sort of thing. Rather, he was talking about silvopasture as a sustainable land management practice where we're integrating intensive animal husbandry and silviculture and forage management such that trees are providing or have the potential to provide long-term returns, and the grazing livestock can generate annual income. And in this context, we often use what we call the 4I principle, and that is a hallmark of silvopasture and other agroforestry practices, and that is that they are intentional. I'm thinking about what pieces do I put together and how do I manage those? They are integrated. It's not the trees are here and the grass is there. They're intensive. We have to be actively engaged in managing, and they are interactive. In other words, there are benefits for trees picking up nutrients deep in the profile, dropping those nutrients back in litter, for animals dropping nutrients and trees being able to recover those where grasses don't, that sort of thing. I mean, there's lots of these potential interactions in these systems. So I had to learn, a lot of these things. Another thing that I needed to recognize was that these systems aren't new. If I had searched out some old timers, they probably could have told me that integrating trees into pasture systems was commonplace in the Appalachian region. And I would say this is probably an important management strategy historically. So in a picture like this, which was taken in Blacksburg about more than a decade ago, you've got largely black locust trees. There may be some walnuts in there as well. And the locusts are going to fix nitrogen. So they're going to support the understory forages that are growing there. If you had walnuts, you would have an opportunity for a nut crop. With black locusts, you've also got opportunity for fence posts, and highly rot resistant, and for poles for buildings. And both of these trees would have been potential energy sources as fuel wood. And, think about it. When they were doing this, they didn't have the local co-op to go to buy a lot of these products. So this would have been, again, common within the region. Now, I didn't know that, and I didn't talk to old timers. So the first part of my work was to look into the literature. And sometimes, you have to dig deep and find some obscure resources. So, for example, Neal in Tennessee, about 80 years ago, reported that bluegrass pastures when they were integrated with walnut or honey locust trees, had greater carrying capacity versus unshaded pastures. And then Smith, doing work in southern Ohio, reported greater fescue yield and improved composition under walnuts and black locusts. So again, interesting to me in the time frame because this predates the availability of nitrogen fertilizers, and so this is work that change is going to happen in the 40s and 50s, right, as we turn ammunition plants into fertilizer plants. So I'm looking at the value or the potential value of this and thinking maybe we walked away from this management before we really understood its potential. There was also way back from about 70 years ago that reported on animal responses to shade. This is work out of Arkansas, looking both at gain and changes in animal behavior. And the take homes are that, excuse me, that shade improves animal gain, both for cows and calves. You can see that the red highlighted lines are showing significant average daily gain difference when they had access to natural shade for cows and calves. Calves were also doing well with artificial shade at that point. At any rate, those were significant effects of shade on animal output. And these responses are due in part to changes in animal time budget and energy expenditure. And I think it's often interesting. There are studies, in fact, I was reading something recently from Uruguay, and they were talking about increased grazing time. But at least in this case, you see animals don't have differences in grazing time generally. So if you look at cows and calves under natural shade or cows and calves under artificial shade or no shade, they're all in this kind of 4 hours for mama and 3 hours kind of time frame for calves. But when we look at standing behavior, those animals that have access to shade are spending less time standing and they're spending more time lying down. And lying down is also often accompanied by rumination, which is improving, digestion, breakdown of the forages that they've been eating. So, we have energy sparing activities and, probably other behaviors that will help improve diet digestibility. So I was from that early kind of literature dive learning that trees and shade might have some productive values in livestock systems, but I really wasn't hooked on any of this until we started generating some of our own data. And so this graph that you see, it shows forage yield response across 3 different tree densities. Now we had honey locust trees and black walnut trees, and these are the means for across the 2 different species. And we had these trees at different slope positions. We also looked at that. And then we had, and so there means across species and slope, but we had trees at very low density. So we say low shade, low tree density, medium shade, medium tree density, and high shade, high tree density. So kind of the same thing. And what was really interesting for me was 2002, the state was under water restrictions. It was extremely dry. In 2003, it was kind of like the good Lord never turned off the tap. I mean, it was just rainy all season. And so with these young trees, I mean, they're 7, 8 years old or so, we have about a 15% increase in yield with moderate tree density in both wet and dry season. So no sort of season to season interaction, which was quite intriguing. And this is really where I start to get interested in silvopastures. And quite frankly, this kind of early work and success was kind of something that kept me going despite the indifference or disdain that I would get from colleagues or producers when I was like, hey, we could put trees in pastures. That's, they're thinking, sure, nobody wants that. Just like that's where I started out. So another maybe a reason for the pushback is when I was working with honey locust, and I'll tell you this: every publication just about that I've submitted that has anything to do with honey locust, there's a reviewer that says, "Why in the world would you want to plant this stuff? It's just going to be a thorny mess and a bad thicket, blah 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 blah." And very fair. I mean, I'd never worked with honey locust. We didn't have it growing up on the farm, so I didn't really realize what that was. We were working with grafted honey locust trees. The variety is called millwood, and they produce a very big fat pod full of sugary material, probably lots of pectin. And the graft is taken from higher up in the tree where it doesn't produce thorns. And so that was the basis for that work. Um, and these trees have been quite productive from a pod standpoint. And where we have thinned the trees out, these are actually we thinned wild type trees that we had planted, or not I, but Dr. Berger had planted. And when we've had animals in there, that's the first thing they go to when they learn that they can eat that stuff. And when we look at the pods, the nutritional value of the millwood pods is actually comparable to whole ear corn or to oat grains. You can see fairly low neutral detergent fiber, acid detergent fiber comparable to what you would have in oat grain, a little bit more lignin. You do have that kind of cuticular or heavy outer layer of the pod, and protein is a little bit lower than oat grain, but comparable to whole ear dent corn. So there have been people that are interested in this, and there are actually some studies in the 40s where at Auburn they fed honey locust pods to cattle, dairy cattle, and had comparable production to those ones that were supplemented with oats. And that stands to reason based on some of these numbers. So, in those first years, it was kind of interesting. Our honey locust trees were actually growing more rapidly than the walnuts. But as they've started putting energy into pod production, the tree growth has slowed down, and they've been far surpassed by most of the walnut trees. And you can see that these are not quite to scale probably, but you can see the honey locust trees are on the left. They are smaller and more open in stature or in canopy structure. And the walnuts sometimes remind me of truffula trees, if you're familiar with Dr. Seuss. Now, they look that way, like big pom-poms on the stem, because we do actively manage the trees, or have managed the trees to remove the lower branches to make it easier to move along the site, and to get light into the site as well. So the initial work said, hey, you're going to get a yield boost. And so that really intrigued me, and I was really all excited about that. But again, that was early years with younger trees. And what we've seen over time is that the trees are changing the forage system. And especially under walnuts, whether it's because of the higher shade from the walnut tree, or the allelopathy of some juglone that the tree produces, or some combination of those, we do see more annual and weedy species under the black walnut trees. But maybe that's not all bad if we're reducing some of the tall fescue. And so, what we see, you can see these differences. The red column under black walnut, you've got less tall fescue and more Kentucky bluegrass, but you also have less red clover and a higher component of broadleaf weeds or some other undesirable grasses. And again, this is from probably our most recent study on the site from Pent, a 3-year study, and again, about a 25% reduction, maybe a little bit more than a 25% reduction under the black walnut, which is marked in black, the yellow for honey locust, and the green for the open pasture systems. So they say, well, okay, that's terrible. You got less forage. And everybody's worried about the production function of the forages, and I get that. But let's look at the animal performance functions here. So we put sheep on these systems, and these are, again, so the 3 years of data on that site. Black walnut, honey locust, open pastures, no difference in gain year 1 or year 2. Actually, had a little higher gain under the black walnut in year 3. You say, well, how do you do that? Well, first of all, you have to adjust the stocking rate to the available forages. So we did reduce the stocking rate. So maybe that makes sense. You got a little more gain, you got a little better opportunity for the animal to select forage. And you say, well, okay, what's that mean in terms of total output? So if we take the number of animals we have times their gain over the land area basis, or whatever, by system, what we have for that summer grazing period is comparable total animal gain among these systems. And yeah, I'll take the criticism that he did use that lower stocking rate, but again, we have to make that compromise. And this is just a summer study. So, we may have lower productivity out of, say, a walnut system later on. But, anyway, that's kind of the parameter that we have to work with to do the research. Um, it was interesting to us when we started looking at animal behavioral effects that just like that work from Arkansas, animals with access to shade in our environment spent similar amounts of time grazing. So you've got these dots that feature for the time budget, and you can see the green, the yellow, and the black are all pretty close in terms of grazing time in minutes per day. The black's a little higher. Again, they probably spent a little bit more time searching, or maybe they had a little more opportunity because of the lower stocking rate. But because these animals are routinely using shade, they're generally cooler during the hottest part of the day, and that's no big news there. You can see that in this top right graph. You can see that fairly strong temperature differential. So maybe a peak difference from 38.5 to 39.95. So that's a degree centigrade, so a little bit more than 2 degrees in Fahrenheit measured there, which means that's less energy that animal has to spend to maintain homeostasis. And this also translates into lower stress levels. We have used hair cortisol as our measure of stress hormone. If you move the animal and you're trying to measure blood, their cortisol level spikes, but the hair cortisol gives us a kind of a chronic measure because the cortisol in the blood is getting into the hair and that carries out over time. So anyway, you can see hair cortisol levels are, maybe 50% higher or maybe 100% higher in some cases for those animals that are in the open systems. I said we're in the fescue belt. Shade is critical for us. That may not be something that you're worried about in Iowa, but who knows? It may be coming to you as we warm up and plant systems move further north, tracking environmental conditions that are suitable. I don't want to get into the whole fescue toxicosis talks that I would have to give, but I want to just show you that these animals that are on non-toxic fescue in the background, they're doing fine. These in the front, they're hot. And so most of our fescue in Virginia that we have to manage is this toxic material, and animals are stressed. And so they're often standing in streams or, under that shade tree or whatever. So this study was conducted in Missouri. I've been waiting on Rob to get it published, and he hasn't done that yet. And he was using shade structures, so there's a little bit of a caveat there. But he was asking this question in the context of a silvopasture talk. Do we need more trees or better grass? So we could take infected fescue. Put my cursor over here. We can take infected fescue, and we have very low calving percentage and very low weaning weights. And somebody says, well, that's not real. No producer would survive. That's right, but this is how we have to do the research, right? What producers are doing is they're letting their animals run into the woods. So here's the infected fescue, and they're getting some level of shade. Now, what happens? Calving rates go up to about 90%. Okay, fantastic. And greater weaning weights. That's the way producers are managing this problem. And, we advocate getting rid of infected fescue and going to non-toxic fescue. And what's interesting in that's a very good strategy and very appropriate. But in that, the calving rate change from infected to uninfected, or non-toxic, I should say, is not as great as going from infected without shade to infected with shade, showing the very real value and benefit of shade in these systems. And, we have a lot of people in Virginia that are buying things like shade havens, and I'm not trying to knock that, but I would say, maybe we could plant 40 acres of pines and get shade across the landscape for much of the farm and not have the depreciation, but instead have the appreciation of the pine system. That may not be appropriate for Iowa, but that's something we think about. So, one of the questions we're asked is change coming? And where am I on time, folks? 127. Okay. So, we have empirical evidence that there may be some changes or adoption coming in the United States, but it's still pretty low, really. So the percent change or the percentage of producers that were using this in Virginia from the 2012 NAS was 0.16, and that's reporting alley cropping or silvopasture. And in 2017, it's a little more broad. They just call it agroforestry. So we've gone from 0.16 to 3.5%. And so, that sounds huge, but it's not, still not a huge portion. And a lot of that agroforestry practice might mean people that are just putting in riparian buffers. So, what we've done is we want to understand producers, and we've decided to do some survey work. And Wilkins was a student in forestry, actually. She sent surveys to over 300 Virginia producers about their feelings on silvopasture, and she got about a 45% success rate or response rate. Maybe you won't be surprised, 95% were white male, and the majority were also over 50 years old. But some of the interesting things here, people were interested or not, didn't differ. That their interest or lack thereof didn't differ by operation size or by the type of livestock they had, or whether or not they were full-time farmers. The point of their interest was either based on finance or culture, and that's a big one, right? We've been fighting trees here for 6 generations or 10 generations, and you're not going to tell us to plant trees now. That's we get a lot of that. Or they might be interested in some sort of tree-based diversification. We also looked at their interest relative to planting versus thinning. And, hands down, if you look at this slide, many more people would consider thinning than planting. And almost half are very uninterested in planting trees. But the producer views of the opportunities and the constraints for these systems could be telling. So again, let's look over here. Only about 8% were very interested in planting. Most are not interested in planting. You do see a more stronger interest on the thinning side. So when we think about potential planters, shade is a major concern. They want something to provide shade for their trees. So 64% saying they're interested in that. Let me get my person in the right spot. 64% saying they're interested in that. If we're thinking about thinners, silvopasture is more an opportunity to increase pasture, and shade is kind of a secondary consideration. So here's pasture expansion versus shade for livestock. That's comparable, but it's not. You don't have a strong signal there. When you think about the constraints, planting is viewed by almost half of the respondents as a likely cause or likely to cause lost pasture production and require a lot of money and time. And so they're not interested in that. And they think that thinning is a cheaper and quicker way to get to it. It may or may not be quicker, but it's probably not cheaper. So, we have some work to do probably to help producers think about what these options really mean. The other issue for us is that because of that fescue situation, our systems are very low input. We're used to not getting much, so we're used to not putting in much because we don't expect much in return. That's the norm in Virginia. And so when we're thinking about silvopastures and their management, they're intensive, as we noted before, and we need to think about how do we manage that appropriately. We do see some adoption. These are both sites where people have thinned pine stands in different approaches. And some of these people already have some level of forestry background, so they, maybe a little more ready to make the jump to managing trees. In the case of the one on the right, that guy had a pine stand as part of his farm, and he's like, well, let me see how I can do a better job of using this, and make it beneficial for my livestock. We also, a lot of concern about when you think about planting is expense, and what do we need to do to protect it? And I'm not sure in our context if we need to do all the protection work for some of these yellow pine species that are maybe less palatable to livestock. But even with hardwood systems, and we're seeing producers come up with solutions to get these things established. So this is from a Producers Engaged with Silvopasture video series that we have. If you wanted to look at that, and this is Wynn Miller. And what she's done is she's learned to use the fence line as part of her, or the tree protection as part of her fencing system. And then she's run a hot wire down the side of the tube so the cows don't use that as a scratching post. Um, we have some over yielding information. Former student did a meta-analysis, and it suggests that silvopastures are 40 to 50% more productive than monocultures, depending on how you measure that. That has long been my interest, but I think there's a lot more concern now around issues of climate change. It is getting warmer. We are having longer growing seasons in Virginia. And oops, hit the wrong slide button there. And so you're seeing groups that are looking at silvopasture as a potential way to provide some sort of carbon drawdown benefit. And there are a number of other entities that are working to help get trees and systems, particularly around this kind of idea of carbon benefit or ecosystem health and that sort of thing. So I'm getting a little bit long here. I apologize. I've got just a couple of slides to think about Iowa. What about Iowa? Is this something that could be done in your state? And it was interesting to me. I went back and looked at some of the land cover information. So in 1630, Iowa was largely grassland with a little bit of forest. What have I got? I've got 1800, same deal. 1850, same deal. 1900, it's mostly crop ground. And I don't want to paint Iowa with one big crop ground brush, but it's heavily cropped. And it's interesting. You have this history of savanna, at least in Iowa, and that would be a real potential place to look at kind of redeveloping some grassland pasture-based systems with trees in the context of a restoration program where oak savanna is kind of the outcome that you're targeting. This is, I don't know if you can read the text, but it says the U.S. hosts a globally imperiled ecosystem, the oak savanna, and too few of us recognize that. So, is there a value here, and how do we help producers realize the value of managing at least part of their land with these types of systems? And I was looking at this again. This is just another map that shows some of the distribution of these oak savannas. So I don't bring any real answers to that. Many of you probably know Matt Liebman, who's been doing a lot of work on prairie strips. And Matt was here at Virginia Tech a decade ago, probably or more. And I went to his seminar, and he said, we've asked farmers about planting trees, and nobody wants trees in Iowa. I said, oh, okay. And I get that. I mean, you got a tree that plugs up a tile drain, that'd be a problem. But there are probably parts of Iowa that aren't under heavy cropping, and you could do something like this. So this is a student's new research project where he's looking at different types of species and vegetation management, and trying and protection system, and see what works and what the costs are and that sort of thing. Hybrid poplar has a potential as a fodder tree, but in this case, they just take a bare root, or not a bare root, just take a stake, a live cutting, stick it in the ground, and if it roots and sprouts, we're good to go. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to explore not only trees that have a number of ecosystem service benefits, but also production function benefits, ways to get trees up quickly, compatible or how to say this, in conjunction with trees that are more slow. So maybe the hybrid poplar comes out over time, that sort of thing. Recent work on willow showing its benefits for immunocompetence, that sort of thing. So I think there's a lot of phytochemistry work that could be done looking at the nutritional value beyond just simple fiber and protein sort of stuff. Anyway, lots of questions. I'm going to stop there and just say thanks. There are some other slides I think maybe somebody wants to talk
I
about
will.
relative to.
I
Go
You
ahead,
bet,
Matt.
John. You can take a drink of water, get ready. We got lots of questions. Oops.
All right.
I'll have
Oh,
well,
you need that share back.
I
Okay,
do
I'm
need
sorry.
it. I do need it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah,
Well,
yeah, yeah.
although I
Sorry
can do
about
the
that.
first one without any problem. So Elena Whitaker, if you need a CCA CEU, please email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW at iastate.edu. by 5 o'clock today. Include your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. Again, alenaw@iastate.edu. We can go to the next slide. If your
Yeah,
fo-
I hit
folks
it,
are
but it didn't go.
okay. Okay.
Yes,
Uh,
there you go.
there you go. Yep. If you watch this webinar live and are willing to fill out a voluntary demographic survey, we'd greatly appreciate it. Only one is needed for a 2025 webinar. So if you've done one already, thank you. And if you're willing, that would be fabulous as well. Probably got a couple more slides. Let's go to the next one to plug the webinar for next week. All right, we are getting some folks from the University of Nebraska Lincoln. Dang, it's like we're doing a tour of uh, where I've been to school, Virginia Tech, and now to the University of Nebraska Lincoln. And we're going to start looking at or have a presentation on evaluation of diverse cover crops across Nebraska. So super excited to see that. And then probably the last slide is if you know somebody that might like this webinar, or if you want to go back and watch it, I might do that. Uh, this will be archived on the Iowa Learning Farms website or at the YouTube Iowa Learning Farms webinars channel as well. John, I will get to the questions, so if you can take that screen share off if you want. And I'll just say there might even some of the work we do here with nutrient reduction, we use wood chip bioreactors in a lot of cases. And so that could be thinking about what trees we could grow in some of these silvopasture to utilize for the wood chips might be another item. Let's get to some of these questions. One of the first ones, when you reduced the stocking rate, did you do that for all three pasture types?
So we were managing, again, we're trying to match supply to animal numbers. So we
Okay.
had, 5 or 6 sheep in, I think we would have 6 sheep in our experimental pastures. They're small experimental units. And then the other one, which had this, again, 25-30% less forage, uh, we couldn't cut out a sheep and a half. So we just took out 1 sheep and we were at, instead of 6, we were at 5 or whatever. And that worked pretty well.
Okay. And this one, so that somebody had asked if you similar research looking at other ruminants beyond cattle, but I think some of your work was with sheep.
So we have these systems, and let me back up here. I'm going to frame something. I think they're artificial, and I will take
Yeah.
that criticism, any day of the week because that's what scientists do. We're reductionists, right? Okay, what does this system with this tree look like versus an open pasture? So a farmer, I don't think is going to manage that way, right? They're going to say, okay, I've got a heat wave coming and I've been letting that silvopasture sit and I'm going to bring these animals back in here. And they may say, okay, the girls are going to have access to the silvopasture, but they're also going to have access to the open pasture. And if weather conditions permit and they're hungry enough, they can go out and get stuff in the open. And then they come back under the silvopasture and graze that. So maybe you've got a central site for the silvopasture and you've got paddocks all around it. And so you've got access points that make that work. So
Mhm.
I think on the one hand, I kind of wonder if we p-value or underestimate the value of how those trees in that system can be beneficial. So I don't know.
Yeah.
We do have some beef cattle work. We have another research station where pine stands were thinned and an oak hardwood, largely oak hardwood stand was thinned. And kind of comparable levels of productivity and the less thermal stress on those animals that were in the silvopastures. That work is a little bit less robust. We don't have as many years of data out of that. And that's a function of some of the operational considerations or issues that are happening at that research station.
Yep.
And we would probably do some additional thinning and that sort of thing over time if we could. But be that as it may, here's a question I like to ask audiences. Let's say it's a nice hot day, and you've got the opportunity to go eat at an all-you-can-eat buffet. Okay, but they don't have enough room, and they're going to put all of the food outside and it's 90 degrees or 85 degrees and 75% relative humidity, you can have the whole buffet outside. Or, we got a few chairs in the restaurant, and we're going to cut the meal down to half, 70% of what's available in the all you can eat buffet.
But you're going to be more comfortable.
But you're going to be
So
sitting there
yeah,
under the fan, where
yeah,
the air conditioner died, but you got a fan.
yeah, yeah,
I mean, think about what comfort means for you, and then put yourself in an animal's hooves, as it were, and think about how that might work there. So
yeah,
I think I don't discount the value of production. That's what we do all the time. But I
yeah,
don't think that production tells the whole story when we're thinking about how much grass do I have, right?
yeah.
Because it's not only how much grass, it's how nutritious is the grass, what can the animal do with it, what does the animal do with its neighbors, if they're beating each other up because they're hot. When you have sheep, they'll stand around on a cluster and they'll put their heads under each other. And so they're standing, they're hot, and they're not doing anything. When we have sheep in silvopasture, I've gone out a time or two. We have coyotes here, and I'm thinking, oh Lord, I've lost a bunch of sheep to coyotes because they'll be sprawled out on their sides with their legs stuck out, and you're thinking that's dead. And they have completely different kind of behavior. I don't know if it's a comfort factor or what. But you'll get there and they'll pop up, and you're like, oh, I feel better now. But it's completely
Well,
different to how they behave in the open system, whether that's
okay.
fear or whatever.
Yeah,
Anyway, I'm going on too
yeah,
long. They're
yeah,
running out of time. Get questions.
okay. So there are a couple of questions about the kind of the trees and the planting. So one was, how old does a tree have to be to provide enough shade to benefit the livestock? And then one of them, somebody asked kind of a question I was thinking about was any pros and cons between linear plantings versus more irregular placement of trees?
So as far as tree age is concerned, I mean, I think one of the real challenges for these systems is they're not prescriptive. I mean, you know what the corn grain population needs to be to get a certain kind of productivity on an Iowa field of soil X versus soil Y, and nutrient inputs and that kind of stuff. Um, we would look at try to match trees to sites where we can. So walnut is not suited for everywhere, just like willow probably is not suited for
Mhm.
everywhere. Um, so that's important. And of course, the better the site selection job you've done, if that tree is suited to the site, then probably the better its growth is going to be. If it's a slow growing tree, it's a slow growing tree. Now, I have people say, well, you're not going to get any shade from these trees for 5, 10 years. Well, I don't know. Even a tree, I've seen cows kind of lie down close to trees that were 4 feet tall, three
Okay.
feet tall. There's a little bit of shade cast there. So can you keep them off of it, but close enough to get some shade? That's kind of where the question is. So, um, yeah. So again, match trees to sites, match trees for function. I mean, you might think about some of these trees as a feed resource. Historic droughts in the early 90s, if I remember right, as a kid, there were, or maybe before then. I just remember reading back when we had newspapers. I remember reading in the newspaper, seeing the pictures of all these people cutting down cottonwood, sycamore, willow, whatever they could cut down as an emergency feed resource. Now, that's maybe no good for your Iowa corn and soybean farmer, but if you've got uh, land being managed for cattle, you certainly can do that. And recently, I was told about a guy who actually harvested his willow with a forage harvester and fed his dairy cows when they had
Oh,
a drought
really?
there. So that, I mean, you have to have the right willow for that, right? So, but anyway, put that aside. So the other question was about linear
Yeah.
versus
It,
nonlinear plantings, and I think there's a couple of considerations there. One, how much do you need to get equipment through? And so something like a linear planting might work very well. You could, in fact, create sort of round or irregular pods of trees. And in some cases, that might even actually improve the productivity of trees, but you're still going to be thinking about thinning them out over time, probably. And the other feature there is kind of if you want something irregular and you're okay to work with that with your equipment and infrastructure, um, how does it look? I mean, I've had people tell me that they get more money for the rental on their property because they got trees in their pasture systems. And I've
Hmm.
had a producer, I was actually used to be with one of the top NRCS grassland people. He said, I'm convinced I sold my farm at a higher value because I had trees in it. And linear is probably okay in that context, but you might even be able to make it more appealing just by what was it? My dad used to tell me, straight is the line of duty, curved is the line of beauty, or some kind of something like
Okay.
that.
All right. All
So
right.
um, or maybe it's the other way around. Curved, I
No, I
mean,
think you're probably right.
the
Yeah.
other
Yeah.
order, curved is
Yeah.
beauty, straight is beauty.
Yeah.
Anyway, you get the point. So, you can think about designing these systems for function, but you can also think about aesthetic design as well. And, when you're ready to sell, hope somebody appreciates your sense of aesthetics.
Yeah. There were a couple questions in here. You talked about that honey locust and thorn, the concern about thorns. And there are a
Yep. Yeah.
couple people that ask if a seed formed from that
Yes.
grafted honey locust, or if a
Yes.
seed formed from that
Yes.
honey. Okay,
Yes,
will
I
it
know
will
that
it have
question.
thorns?
The seed
Yeah.
still has the thorn gene. Now, there
Okay.
are inermis. That's so it's Gladicia triacanthus is the
Okay.
species, genus and species name. And then there's what you call a variant called inermis, which means smooth, no thorns. And
Okay.
there are inermis lines out there that have been selected, a lot of ornamental honey locust plantings that don't have thorns, but most of those also don't have pods, and they may just be male trees.
Okay.
But I'm working with some people, or I interact with, is a better way to say it, who've been doing some work. They have found smooth trees or thornless trees that produce thick pods with lots of sugar in them.
Oh,
And
okay.
and one of the things that we see is when a tree gets hurt, it responds by saying, "You're not going to do that again." And that's where like you had some kind of something hit that tree, and that's where those thorns come. And you'll see that with say black locust. If you cut it off, all the shoots that grow back, they have these really big thorns, whereas normally the thorns are rather small. So that's a tree's self-preservation method. And this one group that I was talking with, the guy said, I've been growing these enormous trees with big pods for a number of years. He said, I've bush hogged them 2 or 3 times and they haven't produced thorns yet. So I'm pretty confident that, and so I think there's going to be opportunity to get those types of trees in the future. But
Okay.
yes, a grafted tree from a thorny variety, even if it's thornless, is going to pass on that gene.
Okay. If you're willing to take a couple more questions,
I will take
bigger.
whatever. I mean, I can go
Okay. All
past
right.
two, whatever you want.
Okay. All right. As usual, when we have something on trees, there's always lots of questions. It's pretty amazing. Can you walk us through what the silvopasture management process looks like over the course of a year in different seasons?
Okay, so if you're if so that would be that would be helpful for me to have some context.
Okay.
I mean, is this again? I mean, let's say I'm in Central Virginia, we can grow loblolly pines, which have some value. You might be sticking pines in the ground, put up a hot wire on either side of it, and walk on, and
Okay.
then you rotate through, and that's kind of the end of it. You may actually, I had a picture in my slide set from a guy in North Carolina that's doing this. You may put herbicide down to help release those trees and let them grow more rapidly. Some people would do that. You have to have the appropriate herbicide in the appropriate place for different, like the hardwoods have a different chemistry. Some of the pines you can actually just kind of spray over them with the right herbicides and kill the understory, and they can be very rapid growing in that way. Um, the people that are doing the honey locust pod development or tree development, they are in the business of establishing silvopastures, and they have what they call an aftercare program. They'll come in and they'll plant trees. They'll come back and look at the trees in the tubes, see how they're doing. If there are weeds or invasive species in the tubes, they'll pull them out. They mulch around the tree and they make a big volcano around the tube. And they say, we don't recommend that in hort settings, but we got a tube around it so the chips aren't on the tree.
Oh,
So
yeah.
that's okay. And so that provides some vegetation suppression. It puts organic matter back into the system, and those trees are more fungally dominated, or driven by a more fungally dominated system. So adding carbon and supporting fungi in that area is probably a good thing. And so a follow up might be adding some more chips back to the space around the tree, but that might not happen for 2 or 3 years or so. It's kind of
Okay.
depending on turnover rate, the type of chip you have, blah, blah, blah. Um, One of the producers that was the first producer in Virginia that got cost share for silvopasture establishment, he put up sort of semi-permanent fence on one side of the tree, and he had, I guess, in some places he had semi-permanent on both sides. In some places he had like the paddock fence line and then the semi-permanent. Anyway, some of the ways that he had made the configurations allowed him to manage his rotation. So let's say I've got two fingers sticking out into the field, and so he tell his kid, "Well, go put the fence over here in this section, and that's where the cows will graze today." And then you move the fence to the next section, and so actually the tree protections helped set up his rotation and made his life
Okay.
easier. Um, he has, in those contexts, particularly what he was doing was with electric lines on either side of the tree. He did have to do some mowing or clipping around. He has kind of a little walk behind mower. So then you get into these questions of how do you do this with scale? And those issues like where I showed you with those trees with that underpass system where you've got the fence line across the top and you've got the tree tube there, the cows walk through, and so those maintenance issues kind of go away.
Hmm.
But you do want to make sure you've got trees coming on that they're looking okay. Um, so different trees, different growth rates, different growth form, that's going to affect, whether and how much you want to prune on that tree as it gets older. Of course, you're assuming once you start doing some of that, that if they were in tubes, that they have split the tube open by that time, that sort of thing. So, there's,
Hmm.
it's, I can't tell you one size fits all.
Yeah.
This is how you got to do it.
Yeah. Kind of another management one though here is any special needs for thinning an existing stand of naturalized trees to create a silver pasture. Um, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, my advice for any silvopasture adventure, and I say that whether planting or thinning, my advice is to form a team.
Okay.
I mean, that you look at our extension publications, the first one we did, that's one like the first recommendation: build a team. You're going to have people that know something about trees. You're going to have people that know something about livestock and grasses. And, if you've got somebody that's coming on the farm to do field work or whatever, you need to talk to them about how big's the boom sprayer and, what do they need to be able to get equipment in and out of that farm. All of that stuff is so build a team. So, all right. In the specific context of thinning, consulting forester would be really helpful. Uh, One of my forester friends, this is sorry for this aside anecdote here, but one of my forester friends says he likes silvopasture very much because it's a gateway drug. He said if people could start thinking about thinning trees and managing trees for silvopasture, that opens a gate or a door to thinking about managing all of the forest canopy that they have on their land. And that's often, the least looked at, least managed, least cared for piece of dirt that we got on the whole farm. So the consulting forester can help you look at what trees you have that may have some potential value. The consulting forester, if you're thinking about long-term health of that forest, you don't want a high grade. So high grading would be taking out the trees that have value and leaving all the junk trees
Yeah.
behind. We have a lot of that happens, and that means you have poor genetic resources left supporting that, the future of that forest. And you really would like to have good trees left behind. But maybe the trees that you have left behind are subdominant. And if they're like, we have a lot of white oak, and white oaks are very prone to what we call epicormic branching. So they get stressed, they get heat on the side of the tree once you've opened up that canopy, and there are latent or asleep buds underneath the bark. And so the heat comes in and the buds here, and suddenly you got these little branches that stick out on the side of the tree. And so if the thinning is too harsh,
Mm.
whether from compaction, whether from cutting too many trees, it can be really stressful. I mean, we've seen cases where the trees grow faster initially, suddenly got a lot more resources, but the stress catches up with them, and that's a
Okay.
problem. So you really want to work with a forester, and you need to be clear about what your objectives are. And there are different ways to go about it. You might cut strips through and not worry about species selection, or you might think about what timber can I get out of this that has value, but also leave something that has value for the future. So I'm hesitant to say this is how you
Yeah.
do it, but again, work with somebody that can help you think through those questions.
Yeah. All right. I think that gets at most of the questions in there. And in the interest of time and your time, we'll probably end it there. Really appreciate this. Again, if folks need are wanting a CCA CEU, please email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW, at iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today with your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. And John, thank you so very much for sharing this information. I found it extremely, extremely fascinating and extremely relevant to Iowa conditions, especially as we think of, potential for more heat stress in the future with any warmer conditions. The more that we can have shade for our uh, pasture-based livestock, it seems like the better.
Well, thank you. Saw Mark Kopecki gave me a bit of a
Yeah.
shout out, and Mark's been thinking about syntropic agriculture, where we're mixing and trying to take tree products, put them back into helping soil health. And we have some
Oh,
questions about whether you could do that in a temperate context. But your conversation around this um, biofilter, as it were, and the potential to use trees in that context, again, kind of points me back to that syntropic agriculture conversation. So uh, maybe a conversation for another time.
okay.
Matt, I really thank you for the opportunity to
Yeah.
speak. I appreciate the invitation. And if there are questions, you've got my email or whatever. Happy to, go further on the subject with you.
Okay. Thanks again. Thanks again, John. That was
Yep.
great.
Thank you.
Yep.